Okay, a few weeks ago was indulging one of my favorite masochistic pastimes and scrolling through my Twitter feed when I came across the news that Aquaman had been recently confirmed as queer in the Young Justice cartoon I didn't know existed. Plus the following galaxy-brain hot take by some rando. Do gay kids even watch superhero cartoons? They just out here confusing stray little boys, SMH. Seems irresponsible to me. Normally, I would simply ignore what is obvious homophobic trolling, but that particular day I was feeling inspired. So instead I decided to sit down and make this YouTube video you are now watching. You're welcome. You see, like so much of our culture, superheroes and superhero stories are strongly linked to heterosexual men, having for a long time been made almost exclusively by and for them. And while that's still mostly true today, queer people have always been fans of superhero comics and films, yet I wouldn't say that being brought up at all if not for the fact I actively cultivate my online presence to be surrounded by queerness. The answer to the question, do gay kids even watch superhero cartoons, is a deafening, of course, jackass. But I'm less interested in the do they so much as in the why do they? Well, the answer is actually very simple. That's because superheroes are gay.
Didn't see that, did you?
All of them.
Maybe put on some clothes.
All of them. Now that that's out of the way, allow me to elaborate. But for the sake of context, I guess I should start with what that original target demographic gets from these stories. Okay, so superhero stories have been a staple of pretty much all cultures in the world for as long as humans have been able to create them. A lot of Greek mythology heavily revolves around them. For instance, you may have heard of Hercules.
Honey, you mean Huncules!
But our focus today is on the modern version of superheroes with the capes and the tights and the spandex.
That is not spandex! The material is a self-assembling memory!
It all started in April of 1938 when DC Comics first introduced us to no other than Superman, a character who went on to not only change popular culture forever, but also, unsurprisingly, to serve as a role model for young boys of pretty much every generation since then. I say unsurprisingly because really that's the whole point of heroic figures. As author Norma Pecora puts it in Superman, Superboys, Supermen, the comic book hero as socializing agent, heroes play an important part in growing up. They offer us ideals and inspiration. We recognize some as possibilities, father or brother, others as desired, rock star or baseball player, and still others as fantasies, Superman or Rambo. So that's why we have superheroes, to present ideals that inspire us to be better versions of ourselves. In the specific case of comic books, they present a lot of qualities that indeed we should aspire to have. Honesty, the bravery to stand up for what is right, compassion for your fellow person. These aren't traits even remotely exclusive to men, of course, but because for the first few decades of superhero comics, the main characters were disproportionately men and all of them, regardless of their gender, were written by men with a male worldview, we have come to view them as part of male culture. Even Wonder Woman, who was created to reflect the image of the 40s liberated woman, started out being written by men, thus reflecting a male idea of female empowerment. In spite of this gender imbalance, male superheroes of the time still presented some very honorable traits to help shape young boys' ideas of that which we've defined as masculinity. Masculinity, by the way, and I'm clarifying this because there are certain sections of the internet that will try to convince you the feminists are claiming otherwise, masculinity is not a bad word, and it is not a bad thing. It simply refers to a group of qualities and behaviors that are typically associated with being a man. It's a social construct divorced of biological sex, meaning you don't have to live by it in order to identify as and be a man. Also, since the term social construct is a little, let's say, triggering for a lot of badass, some PC, freedom thinker, anti-SJW, free speech warriors out there, let me clarify that pointing out something to be a social construct is not the same as saying it isn't real. Money is a social construct. Have you tried going to Starbucks and telling the cashier you're not paying for your strawberry donut frappuccino because money is a capitalist social construct? Anyway, seeing as how the creative minds behind superhero comics were so homogeneous, it was only inevitable that they would end up not only reflecting but reinforcing the current status quo, including their own limited worldview of masculinity. As Pecora explains it, heroes present images of goodness, power, control, confidence, success, and competence. Through popular culture, young boys learn these are the attributes to emulate. They also learn that the way to cope with such behavior is through violence and action. And that's when we enter the territory of toxic masculinity. If you're unfamiliar with the term, congrats on not spending all your waking hours online like I do, but again I have to clarify it because the internet. JSKY, it is not the same as masculinity. As defined by the Good Man Project, toxic masculinity is a narrow and repressive description of manhood, designating manhood as defined by violence, sex, status, and aggression. It's the cultural ideal of manliness, where strength is everything while emotions are a weakness, where sex and brutality are yardsticks by which men are measured, while supposedly feminine traits, which can range from emotional vulnerability to simply not being hypersexual, are the means by which our status as men can be taken away. Pecora goes on to say, in addition to the constellation of qualities that center around mastery and dominance in the socialization of young boys, Kaufman suggests that violence is an institutionalized, acceptable means of solving conflicts. That particular forms of violence are accepted and even encouraged. According to Kaufman, racism, sexism, and heterosexism are socially regulated acts of violence. Masculinity and its inherent sense of power is an ideology that is reinforced and replayed for the young adolescent in the family, at school, among friends, and in comic books. If you've read so much as one issue from the golden or silver ages of comics, you'll know exactly what Pecora and Kaufman are talking about. These pages are filled with our manly heroes displaying hyperaggression, sexism, and heteronormativity. Which is not to say they are bad. I personally like a lot of these early comics, being critical of something you like is possible, people. I'm enjoying it right now. Take the first two female superheroes in the Marvel canon, Invisible Girl and the Wasp, and how they were written as white crazy and vain, or how much the Human Torch's and Iron Man's womanizing ways were not just intrinsically connected to their characters, but presented as aspiring and desirable in a comes with the territory of being a superhero way. So this whole men are strong and invulnerable and solve their problems by punching, while women are damsels in distress who lust after the manly hero, regardless of if they're out saving the world themselves thing, is why these stories became such fulfilling and adored fantasies to so many generations of straight boys. Which reminds me, that's also why whenever some men answer to the decades of criticism of how female characters in comic books tend to be over-sexualized and their skin showing, impractical for battle, glued to their bodies' costumes with, oh, but the inhumanly muscled -% body fat male superheroes are alright, the answer is, yeah. Because they're two expressions of the same thing. They're the same power fantasy. Now, I'm not saying no woman or queer man has ever enjoyed these drawings in a voyeuristic way. God knows I've spent a lot of time locked in my room looking at certain comic book characters myself. But there's false equivalency here because the Tom of Finland shapes male superheroes tend to have are still very much heterosexual male fantasy. The embodiments of idealized hypermasculinity catered to and enjoyed by this group. They're not drawn for women, and they sure as hell are not drawn for gay men. Unless we're talking about Greg Capullo, who, intentionally or not, oh, he's giving us what we want. But as the times changed and our collective ideas of what makes one a man evolved, so did the way these characters were presented. That's not to say that toxic masculinity and heteronormativity have been eradicated from these narratives completely, but in order for the comic industry to remain relevant, they had to adapt to cultural shifts. However, when it comes to queer identities, we only start seeing these popping up after... Well, remember the film industry's production codes we discussed a while back? There was a comic book version of it, aptly called the Comics Code. I know so far I've made it seem like superhero comics were strictly
hetero bullshit.
But the code actually came about after some more observant heteros caught up with the previously stated fact that, despite them being tailor-made cis boys fantasies, superheroes are all gay. As soon as the moral gatekeepers of society caught whiff of how popular this new craze of the superhero comic was with the kids, surprise surprise, they immediately started pointing at it as the new thing corrupting our youth and destroying the moral fabric of society. The most vocal and influential from this group was Dr. Fredric Wertham, a psychiatrist who, in 1954, published the book Seduction on the Innocent. Decrying comics as responsible for promoting juvenile delinquency and sexual deviancy, which, as we've already seen, was code for homosexuality. And given how much popular culture has embraced this hot take ever since, it should come as a shock to no one that the good doctor mostly directed his criticism of said deviancy towards writing about the world's favorite dynamic duo, Wertham said, "Only someone ignorant of the fundamentals of psychiatry and of the psychopathology of sex can fail to realize the subtle atmosphere of homoerotism which pervades the adventure of the mature Batman and his young friend Robin. At home they lead an idyllic life. They are Bruce Wayne and Dick Grayson. Bruce Wayne is described as a socialite. and the official relationship is that Dick is Russ's ward. They live in sumptuous quarters with beautiful flowers in large vases and have a butler, Alfred. It's like a wish dream of two homosexuals living together. Sometimes they are shown on a couch, Bruce reclining and Dick sitting next to him. Jacket off, collar open, and his hand on his friend's arm. Okay, as easy as it is to laugh at and dismiss Wertham's pro-clutching as just good old-fashioned Cold War era moral panic, there's 2 points I need to make here. First, what Wertham is doing is interpreting Batman and Robin's homosocial relationship as homosexual, not the same thing. Homosociality designates same-sex relationships of a non-romantic, non-sexual nature. Do you have a friend who's the same gender as you? Congratulations, you are a homosocial. Second, although Wertham's intentions was to expose Batman and Robin as secret, devious homosexual propaganda, that doesn't mean queer readings and recognition of intentional or, more likely, unintentional queer coding are not valid. If you've been following this channel since the beginning, you've already seen just how invisible queer identities were in mainstream pop culture for most of history, and how every single piece of identification us queer folks have found in it up until very, very recently was reappropriated and interpreted through our queer sensibilities in order to make the stories our own, and comics were no exception. At the same time, Wertham's book was spreading amongst parents faster than Eddie Venom fanarts on pre-titty and cockband Tumblr, the US Congress has set up an official inquiry into the comic industry, leading the major publishers to copy what Hollywood had done years earlier, and setting up their own self-regulating organization, the Comics Code Authority. Also like Hollywood, the code had a policy that expressly forbade so-called sex perversion or any inference to it, effectively banning any openly queer characters to be featured in comic books for the few decades to come. That didn't stop us from finding ourselves in these stories, of course. After all, if there's one thing queer people have mastered, is the art of reclaiming spaces where we're not welcomed. Okay, so the comic industry says we're not invited to their party. Too bad. They can't really stop us from crashing it. Especially because the invitation might say no homos allowed, but the very nature and theme of the party reveals that, and I can't remember if I've mentioned this already, but superheroes are gay.
Guys, we're coming up on the devil's anus.
Let's break it down. I already mentioned that the perfect Bellamy model physique most superheroes sport is a heterosexual male fantasy, but I also noted it can indeed be very appealing to queer men in a different way. So let me get the shallow out there first. It's horny. It's very horny. And that's to say nothing of when we started adapting these stories to live action and, well, let's just say I'm not alone in being thankful for this project's importing this particular aesthetic. Speaking of aesthetic, superhero stories are known to make very good use of camp, which as we've seen before is a style that presents life and prevailing social norms in exaggerated ways, exposing the physicality behind the random and manufactured societal rules we're taught to believe are quote-unquote natural, therefore being attracted to those of us who deviate from said rules. The Tim Burton Batman movies, although theoretically meant to be a more gritty, dark, realistic take on the hero, plays to this camp value a lot. I mean, no surprise there, over the top was Burton's thing back when his imagination wasn't running on empty, but the Joel Schumacher films go even further, as far as they could go without just being the 60s show again. And sometimes just being the 60s show again.
7 million. Never leave the cave without it.
Schumacher's take on Batman is also noteworthy for the fact that, being gay himself, Schumacher provided us with a lot of male gaze moments where the camera adoringly closes on the male physiques of both Batman and Oh my god, 90s Chris O'Donnell! Earring! He's wearing a gay 90s earring! Robin is twunk 90s Chris O'Donnell with a gay 90s earring and he's a bad boy and damaged and I want it!
If you could see that I'm the one who understands you.
Sorry this happens every time I see 90s Chris O'Donnell. Still on aesthetics, have I mentioned the outfits? Catwoman's S&M inspired vinyl attire, Spider-Man's tight spandex, Nuclear Man's everything.
It's beautiful, it's perfect.
As well as everything the costume department did for Batman Forever and Batman and Robin. Now about rating homoeroticism in homosocial relationships. There's the aforementioned domestic life of Batman and Robin, which frankly gets a lot less subtextual in the Schumacher movies where they age up Robin to an unspecified college age and have him played by 20-something-year-old 90s Chris O'Donnell, therefore having less of an adopted father and son angle with first 30-something-year-old Val Kilmer and then 30-something-year-old George Clooney and more of a trading his rich sugar daddy thing going on.
Someone were to fix them up, they could keep one as a fee.
I want a car.
And I don't believe for a second Schumacher didn't know exactly what he was doing, God bless him.
Let me be your partner. You're looking at your new partner. I don't need a friend right now, all right? I need a partner. Not just a friend.
A partner.
There's also my favorite sexy elderly superheroes, the OTP Forever Steve Rogers and Bucky Barnes. I've covered their relationship before, so I'll try not to repeat myself. In the comics, Bucky started as basically Steve's Robin, the child sidekick young readers could see themselves in. What the MCU movies do is ignore that. Teenage sidekick Bucky was retconned in the comics as fictionalized wartime propaganda and a bit of meta mindfuckery anyway, instead going straight to Bucky and Steve being the same age. Best friends from childhood separated by tragedy and reunited again in a friends to enemies to friends again deal. And it is a love story. That's not me saying it. It was admitted as such by the writers, the directors, and even the actors of the movies to some extent.
I care a little bit more about my relationship than what it means to you guys. Bucky's that Achilles heel, and he chooses Bucky.
However, just because it is a love story, it doesn't mean it's necessarily a romantic one. And we can dig deeper into toxic masculinity and homosociality to make a case for both the homo and no homo interpretations of Steve and Bucky. When toxic masculinity dictates quote-unquote real men are only allowed two emotions, anger and horniness, that unsurprisingly affects the way male friendships are formed. After all, friendship means closeness, and closeness demands vulnerability and communication. Two big no-nos for members of the We Missed the Point of Fight Club.
I felt like destroying something beautiful.
Some ways to work around that is by masquerading moments of sincere affection with playful insults, or to obsessively police the heterosexuality of yourself and your friends to prevent being perceived as gay, no homo. And by avoiding physical displays of intimacy, which I think is why straight men do the weird 2 or 3 pats on the back thing in the rare occasions when they hug. Movies, however, tend to be more exaggerated portrayals of real life, and the ones that heavily rely on two men's friendship, like the Cap trilogy does, need to get this relationship across to the audience as succinctly and quickly as possible in order to get us invested in it, meaning showing displays of emotional and even physical intimacy between two men that we're not accustomed to seeing IRL. Thus, our minds shaped by toxic masculinity may be led to perceive them as gay, something that studios and filmmakers are very aware of, so they have to write in stuff in the text to preemptively dismiss these perceptions. And since having two characters wave away the homoeroticism by simply saying no homo and cracking a bunch of homophobic jokes is a little gauche for modern audiences and filmmakers who are not Michael Bay.
Oh, look who came sashaying back. Hair growing like a chia pet. Look at him.
I had a bit of a mild panic attack earlier, right?
That's because you a pussy.
The most common way to do this is to give one or both of them an opposite sex love interest. Knowing all of that, that's why this did not actually come out of nowhere. While we're on that, let me add that given how many people caught on to the homoeroticism present in The Winter Soldier, I don't think it was a coincidence that from Civil War onwards we started seeing the filmmakers contriving more and more excuses for Steve and Bucky to be kept apart, up to ending Steve's arc in the MCU by having him ignore everything he learned in that second movie and time traveling to be with a woman he knew for like 2 months I guess, but is still obsessed with for some reason. Never mind, Peggy was the one who told him to let go of the past and that this ending puts Steve right back where he was at the end of the first Avenger, and all the character development and growth we spent the last 8 years following. Forget it, just toss it, throw it in a garbage can and set it on fire.
What?
For the cherry on top, we only learned via the director's word or God after we had to witness this brutal character fisting that Steve did indeed tell Bucky his plan to undo all that pesky character development of his. You know, off screen. Because who needs closure for the relationship that drove the plot of the 2 movies that got you this cool Avengers job in the first place, right Anthony and Joe? By the way, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying the only reason Stucky was so big was because of internalized toxic masculinity. Even if we were to discount the chemistry between Chris Evans and Sebastian Stan and queer people's self-identification, the films were still very much filled with homoerotic subtext, down to some actual in-text things like Bucky calling Steve a Freudian slang for gay and crossbones, your buddy or Bucky line that is charged with a lot of historical meaning. But you know, We can't make Captain America and the Winter Soldier gay for each other, otherwise straight boys will get angry and go complain about it on Reddit and stop giving us their money. Two bros on top for mice. Two pats on the back because they're not gay. On the other side of all this homoeroticism, superhero stories partake in the grand old tradition of portraying effeminacy as a signifier of deviancy. And because we see effeminate seeing man as a homosexual trait, we fall into the pit of unfortunate implications by equating queerness with villainy. In Batman Forever, the Riddler and Two-Face team up and form a domestic relationship of sorts. The movie also straight up admits Nigma is obsessed with Bruce and even calls the Riddles he sends him his love letters.
Someone's been sending me love letters.
In the Superman movies, we have the aforementioned Nuclear Man and his fabulous nails threatening Soup's masculinity, Zod's fashionable leather boots and open shirt as visual signifiers that something's wrong with this guy, and I will throw Lex Luthor's flamboyancy and obsession with Superman there too, because honestly, every single one of these guy-on-guy supervillain superhero rivalries have a touch of the homoerotic.
Destroy Superman!
Why are you so obsessed with me, bro?
Good night, sweet prince.
Frank Miller once went so far as to describe the Joker as a homophobic nightmare, something which the comics have played into a lot, more so than the movies. I say this obsessive rivalry as a masquerade for sexual desire interpretation also applies to those contrived hero versus hero dick measuring contests that I hate, seeing as how the guys are always more interested in fighting each other than in any heterosexual love interest they're given. Perhaps because fighting is a socially acceptable way for boys to touch other boys.
I felt like destroying something beautiful.
But the queerest element of every one of these stories and the main reason why superheroes are gay is without a doubt the double identity aspect.
You're the Spider-Man from YouTube.
I'm not.
A lot of superheroes have had to create a secret identity in order to protect their loved ones from their armies of enemies, concealing their true selves from everyone but a handful of people they know they can trust. As an addition to that, most superheroes also see and are seen as outsiders due to the abilities they possess, which are often proud of their own nature, and what I'm saying is that superheroes are queer. Take the absolute terror some of them feel at the threat of being unmasked and having their real identity revealed. Who amongst us has not been terrified of the same thing at one point in our lives? We can look at these secret identity alter egos as passing for superheroes, a way to assimilate in a society that tends to hate and fear those who are different. Because we as a species have evolved to develop a grouping mentality, the truth is that being able to pass as what is considered normal can provide us with the sense of belonging our human brains call for, meaning there's comfort to be found in assimilation. But the thing is, superheroes hiding behind their alter egos, just like queer people hiding in the closet, can never truly feel free and accepted when living a lie. Freedom only comes from truth, as do real love and acceptance, which is why so many superheroes and closeted queer folks struggle with having to maintain this facade for too long. One of my favorite illustrations of the duality and struggles of being forced into living a double life comes in Superman. On the one hand, we have the bumbling, shy, clumsy, insensitive Clark Kent, who no one would believe is secretly a superhero. On the other, we have the publicly known figure of Superman, who presents and therefore is associated with all the traditional traits of manhood: strength, aggression, confidence, and just overall virility. We see the inner turmoil Supes goes through to maintain this persona separated, as well as this wish to be like everyone else but also wanting to live as his true self in pretty much every Superman related media. For instance, that was the whole premise of Smallville.
How about this? Is this normal?
In Man of Steel, Papa Kent chastises teenage Clark for using his powers to save a bus full of his classmates from drowning, going so far as to tell him it would have been better to let all the kids die than to show that part of himself.
Oh, Clark, you have to keep this side of yourself a secret.
And that's pretty much all the flashbacks with Papa Kent in this movie. Him desperately trying to shove his son back in the closet and telling him to assimilate because Man of Steel Papa Kent is the absolute worst.
What was I supposed to do? Just let him die?
Maybe.
Like, yeah, I get that he wants to protect his child from being taken away by the government and experimented on, but the way he goes about this is so terribly handled. It's basically a PSA on bad parenting.
Clark, you have to keep this side of yourself a secret.
What was I supposed to do? Just let him die?
Maybe.
It is also the movie where Krypton has an artificial reproduction system that genetically codes people with the necessary traits to serve a particular assigned role in society, which is why Jor-El and Lara had Kal naturally, so he'd be able to forge his own path. And then the first time Jor-El's ghost meets Kal, he tells him he has to go and be Superman, which I find applicable. The duality struggle theme, however, is brought to its peak in Superman 3, when the filmmakers go, subtlety? What is subtlety? And just up and have Superman fight himself. Or better yet, have the hypermasculine Superman, here in pure toxic masculinity mode courtesy of Red Kryptonite, fight Clark Kent. Homophobia and toxic masculinity are two sides of the same coin. One enables the other, so this scene works both as a metaphor to queer people's inner struggle with code switching from their true identity to their publicly accepted passing persona, and to us fighting our own internalized homophobia. It is downright poetic and one of my favorite movie moments ever. That's right, I said it. Die mad.
It's not easy to be me.
But of course, no queer reading a superhero story will be complete without analyzing. Yeah, last year a hetero friend of my friends told me upon first meeting me that he did not like the X-Men, and I'm still baffled as to why 3 people think they can just come up and say shit like that to me and be surprised when I need 5 people to physically stop me from stabbing them with a fork. Anyway, the X-Men were created by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby in the 60s as an allegory for the civil rights movement. They differ from most other Marvel heroes at the time, with their powers coming not from technology or freak accidents, but from mutation, a natural process in human evolution. They are, dare I say it, born this way. Kirby and Lee based Charles Xavier, aka Professor X, on the philosophies of Dr. Martin Luther King, and Eric Lensher, aka Magneto, on the philosophies of Malcolm X. While Xavier believes in peaceful coexistence of mutants and humans alike, Magneto believes that coexistence is impossible, and acts in accordance to a radical worldview of mutant supremacy. Magneto's motivations are further explained once it's revealed that he's a Holocaust survivor, having seen firsthand the evil mankind is capable of, a connection that is very smartly put on the forefront of Magneto's backstory in the movies. The franchise opens with a flashback to Eric's early teenage years as he's being sent to Auschwitz, where he promptly gets separated from his parents and manifests his powers for the first time in a scene that is the best of all scenes. That ties into the fact that one's mutation typically manifests during puberty, triggered by a moment of emotional stress. Like when Rogue's powers awaken when she's having her first kiss in a scene that is also the best of all scenes. And I know a lot of people aren't the biggest fans of Rogue's characterization in these movies, but personally she's always been my favorite. Thanks to my making a parallel between Rogue's sexual desire making her untouchable and how I felt at the realization of my own sexuality. You know the feeling when you're a horny teenager and able to partake in the hormone-induced experimentations that all your heterosexual peers are freely exploring? I do. I hardly think this connection was unique to me. The X-Men started as a racial allegory, but they've always been great stand-ins for any marginalized group, including queer folks. And this reading in particular was amplified in the movie, since how their biggest creative player was... fuck. Okay. Bryan Singer has been a known creep for longer than that brief year in which the film industry pretended to care about sexual abuse, and honestly, I hate that I have to bring him up at all. But it would be dishonest and omitting of my part not to mostly credit him for making the film version of the X-Men so more overtly a queer metaphor. With that being said, I believe Bryan Singer is a sexual predator who belongs in prison and should never be allowed to make another movie again. All of my sympathy and compassion go out to his victims. So, the movies rely heavily on Xavier and Magneto's past and current relationship. They've always had this bitter access dynamic to them, but the movies amp it up. The prequels even more so. We see them meeting in First Class, where a lot of the runtime is devoted to developing their relationship. In Days of Future Past, half of Wolverine's mission plan to prevent the apocalyptic Sentinel future he sent from is to get Eric and Charles back together, and the movie plays their falling out at the end of First Class like a really painful romantic breakup.
You abandoned me! You took her away and you abandoned me!
Where were you, Charles? We were supposed to protect them!
You abandoned us all.
The whole Eric Charles Raven dynamic also reads like two divorced dads trying to convince their daughter that their way is better than the others, like both are trying to put her against the other parent in a really ugly custody battle. Speaking of Raven, she's the first character to truly call out Charles for his assimilation mentality.
Mutant and proud. Or settling with pretty mutations, or invisible ones like yours. But if you're a freak, better hide.
Which I find apt given assimilation has always been a recurring theme of Mystic's character. What with her being a shapeshifter who could hide her natural mutated blue form all her life if she wanted to. Something that's addressed head on back in X2.
Then why not stay in disguise all the time? You know? Look like everyone else.
Because we shouldn't have to.
After her actions at the end of Days of Future Past, Mystique finds herself in the position of being seen as a hero by all of mutant kind, something she's very uncomfortable with, choosing to assimilate in order to hide herself. Yeah, I know a lot of this had to do with Jennifer Lawrence not wanting to sit in the makeup chair anymore and the movie having to work around that, but her arc in Apocalypse serves as a good parallel to the pressure real marginalized people living openly in the public eye may feel to be the perfect sole representative of an entire community. The minority role model, if you will.
They need you.
That's not what they need.
The queerest moment of the entire franchise, though, comes again in X2, when Bobby, aka Iceman, comes out to his family as a mutant, and it is so obvious what they're doing in this scene that I can't understand how people watch these movies yet miss a real-life connection.
Have you tried not being a mutant?
Then we have Stryker, who brought his son to Xavier in hopes of him changing his son's nature through some sort of conversion therapy.
William, you wanted me to cure your son, but mutation is not a disease.
You're lying!
The warnings of the dangers of discrimination and how it can lead to genocide.
Mutants, and the humans who dared to help them.
The search for the mutant gene and the cure for mutation storyline in The Last Stand.
You realize the level of impact this will have on the mutant community?
This moment in X2 that made me gay. Like Jesus Christ, straight people, this movie falls short of just being 2 hours of the cast looking directly into the camera and telling you to stop being homophobic dicks.
Mutant and proud.
But perhaps one reason why that all went straight through some heads is that as queer as these movies are, they never had any openly queer characters in them. Even the ones who were queer in the comics were straight washed in the movies. And like we seen earlier, the comics side, as per the Comics Code Authority guidelines, didn't allow for depictions of openly queer superheroes for decades, meaning we had hundreds, even thousands of stories that made for such great queer parallels in a myriad of ways, therefore explaining their appeal to this audience, but no actual queer characters in the text. Until... Like every time an established medium starts to diversify the very limited type of stories and characters they present, the inclusion of queer characters in superhero comics has been a long and arduous road, filled with roadblocks, reluctance, and resistance from the part of the executive heads, and fury and backlash by homophobic assholes and longtime comics gatekeepers alike.
We did it! We prejudged something without giving it a chance!
I am so proud of us!
But change is inevitable, and progress happens when we fight for it. So we eventually start seeing queer characters being slowly introduced on the pages. They are not by far as prolific as they should be even today, and most are relegated to being members of a larger team, with only a few getting to star in their own series, which more often than not are very limited and short-lived. However, there are enough in the canon of the big two alone that I can't possibly go into every single one of them. So I'll talk a little about some of the ones I think are really important to discuss. In 1988, this introduces our first openly gay superhero, Gregorio de la Vega, aka Extraño, and as you can see from this panel, choices were made. In case you couldn't tell, Extraño, which literally translates to strange or weird or queer, is a very flamboyant and effeminate Peruvian man, chosen by the Guardians of the Universe. I said Guardians of the Universe, as one of a handful of people to take part in an experiment in human evolution. He refers to himself as Auntie, serves as a life coach for those silly straight personal issues, that's what we're here for, and eventually becomes HIV positive when he's attacked by an AIDS vampire called Hemogoblin. You know, Marvel used to get a lot of flack for their limited amount of queer representation compared to DC, but I don't think anyone has ever brought up this guy as proof of DC's progressiveness. But he's the first, so I have to talk about him. Extraño makes a good object of study in the debate of whether it's better to have no representation at all than to have, this. There's nothing wrong with being effeminate or flamboyant or HIV positive, of course. My issue with this dude is that our first gay superhero in all of comicdom is nothing but an amalgamation of stereotypes, up to and including getting infected with that gay disease we were hearing so much about back then. So yeah, much woke, very representation. Here's a glad award to see. In the New Guardians comics, Extraño gets this crystal skull that gives him new powers and butches him up. Likely as an attempt by DC to appease all those queers who were thrilled about how he was presented then as I am now. In DC's 2016 big time changing Rebirth relaunch, he's brought back, now as an actual human being instead of a caricature, and I'm not at all surprised that the writer for this, Steve Orlando, is a bisexual man. Took almost 3 decades and a queer writer to make Extraño not the most offensive thing ever, but we did it! In the early 2000s, we see a genuinely good queer storyline of Green Lantern. When our current GL, Kyle Rayner, tells his teenage assistant Terry Berg that he proposed to his girlfriend Jade, Terry gets visibly angry at the news, lashes out at Kyle, and runs away, but not before Kyle realizes why Terry got so upset. Later, Kyle goes over to Terry's house and assures him there's nothing wrong with him. It's a nice touching moment, and aside from a cheap butt joke thrown in there, it really works. About a year later, we have the 2-parter Hate Crime, and while I do not like the cover of the first issue showing a blooded, busted up Terry still in the middle of being attacked, I was relieved to find none of this gratuitous shock value in the story itself. When Terry kisses his boyfriend David after leaving a club, the two of them are chased down by gay bashers who attack Terry, almost killing him, causing Kyle to get overtaken by his rage and pain, going so far as to torture one of the attackers for information on the other's whereabouts and almost murdering one of them in the process. The first part ends with a desolate Kyle sitting at a comatose Terry's bedside, begging him to wake up. Which he does, in part 2. Under the Vertigo seal, DC also gives us John Constantine in the Hellblazer series, one of the super rare representations of bisexual men in not only comics but all media. The most famous arc in which Constantine's bisexuality comes into play is arguably Brian Azzarello's 5-issue story Ashes and Dust. This guy called Stanley Manor has a love-hate relationship with Constantine because although he's been in love with him and the two of them have been together a few times, Constantine keeps tricking him and fucking him over. Sometimes even fucking him over while just plain fucking him. So at one point, Stanley frames Constantine for a friend of his death, for which JC is arrested, but upon breaking out and learning that he wasn't guilty like he himself was led to believe, he goes to see Stanley and gives him what he most desires in life, a chance to see his parents again, courtesy of S&M magic because Hellblazer. Unfortunately for Stanley, this family reunion does not go as hoped, and as his parents go tell him how much of an embarrassment they find him, Constantine starts laughing and leaves a sight of Stanley hanging there to be emotionally tortured. That's when Stanley decides to kill him for good. For a moment he seems to succeed, but of course it turns out Constantine had tricked him again, reversing the curse Stanley had used on him, and bye bye enemy lover. I mostly like Ashes and Dust, but I do have an issue in that Constantine is described and even depicted in flashbacks as an insatiable greedy bisexual who's into anything sexually and doesn't care about anyone's pleasure but his own. There's a very common stereotype about bi people, they're greedy and promiscuous, so as much as I'm aware that Constantine is this cynical anti-hero asshole who lives in a very morally grey area, I'm still not so sure how I feel about this part. On the Marvel side of things, the label reportedly had a no gays in the Marvel Universe policy in the 80s, as mandated by current editor-in-chief Jim Shooter. That's not to say writers didn't slip in a queer character or two under the radar, but it wasn't until March 1992, after Shooter's reign of terror had ended, that North Star, whose creator John Byrne had always intended to be gay, was finally allowed to come out in an issue of Alpha Flight, becoming the first openly gay Marvel superhero. He comes out in support of organizations searching for an AIDS cure, motivated to do so after he finds and adopts a baby girl dying of the disease. Yeah, of course they had to tie it with AIDS, what else can I write about gay men in 1992, right? But I promise this is not as bad as it sounds. I actually like this story. It's much more the we give a shit type of very special issue like on Green Lantern than... Also in June of 2012, North Star's wedding to regular human Kyle became the first same-sex wedding featured in a Marvel issue, so I have no choice but to stand. Things get a little murkier when you start looking at trans representation. As early as the 40s, there's been this recurring trope where male characters have their consciousness transported to female bodies. That still happens sometimes. Spider-Woman and Loki are two recent examples. But while I can see the case for these storylines being interpreted as a trans metaphor, these characters were never explicitly stated as such, and the gender switching would often happen due to forces outside of one's control. Although we do have characters like Mystique, Superboys Comet, and X-Haven, shapeshifters able to change their physical appearance and alternate genders at will. Masquerade from DC's Blood Syndicate falls into that category. However, it's revealed to us actually assigned as female at birth, but presents as male as an expression of his true identity, making him the first trans man superhero. Lady-wise, in Doom Patrol, Kate Godwin, aka Coagula, is notable not just for being the first trans woman superhero, but also for being created by Rachel Pollack, herself a trans woman. So once more, we have to stand. Unfortunately, trans representation in comics is still very rare, and what little we get is more often than not relegated to supporting character status. Which is not to say these aren't important or awesome characters, Alicia Yo, I'm looking at you, but it is disheartening to see how rarely trans folks get to suit up and save the world, even in comparison to the rest of the LGBTQ spectrum. No. What about lesbian superheroes? Yeah, so I didn't know this, but the first lesbian superhero was the Runaways' Carolina Dean in 2005. She and the rest of the Runaways were introduced 2 years prior, but she didn't come out until 2005, 44 years after the beginning of the Marvel era. DC is an even worse offender, and it wasn't until Greg Rucka reinvented Catherine Kane, aka Batwoman, as a lesbian that we finally got a gay woman superhero in the DC universe. In 2006. Christ. I'd be remiss not to mention how in recent years both Marvel and DC have reinvented a few of their established, long-running characters as queer. Alongside Batwoman, Iceman has been revealed to be gay, and even got to amazing but unsurprisingly short limited series afterwards. While Wonder Woman, Harley Quinn, Poison Ivy, Catwoman, Shatterstar, and Lightspeed are all bisexual now. On the new character side of things, we have amongst others the aforementioned Carolina Dean and X-Haven, as well as Nico Minoru, Wolverine's Kid Daken, James Howlett's Hercules from Earth 1225, and most of the Young Avengers, starting with Billy Kaplan and Teddy Altman, aka Wiccan and Hulkling, aka My Children. They come into a lot of prominence again due to some recent bullshit, but the important thing to know about them is that they are the best. I mean it, they are the best. If you need proof, all you need to know is that their love literally saved the world, as I always imagined gay love would. But yeah, everyone in the Young Avengers second iteration is canonically queer except for Kate Bishop. Or is she? Speaking of which, have you heard about our Lord and Savior, America Chavez? A super powerful lesbian Latina with 2 moms who can punch star-shaped portals to travel through dimensions. She's been a part of the Teen Brigade, the Young Avengers, the A-Force, and the Ultimates, and finally got her own awesome but limited solo series in 2017. So, while the pool of queer superheroes in comics is still more of a puddle, Marvel and DC both have enough of them in their character roster that surely they'd have featured at least one of them in the literal dozens of MCU and DCU movies by now, right? No, they haven't. Actually no, that's not true. We did have Negasonic Teenage Warhead and Yukio in Deadpool 2. They're barely in it, but they're established to be dating. The movies also allude to Deadpool's pansexuality, sorta. Mostly by way of a bunch of juvenile jokes in the first one, but it's there in a slightly more sincere way in the second. And that's about it. Marvel rather infamously went out of their way to cut out a scene alluding to Valkyrie's bisexuality in Thor Ragnarok, and that was after Tessa Thompson and Taika Waititi fought to film it in the first place. The MCU in particular has been criticized a lot for their lack of diversity, and although it would be easy to point the finger at Marvel Studios president Kevin Feige, who's been teasing a gay character for years, he is not to blame, at least not alone. See, up until 2015, Marvel Entertainment CEO that Feige was working under was Isaac Perlmutter, a conservative, sexist, racist asshole who, like all billionaires, only cared about money and maintaining the status quo, and therefore was largely responsible for us getting 3 franchises starring white dudes named Chris before a black and woman superhero solo movie. Add that to international market excuse and I have the recipe for Marvel's reasons why we don't gay. And I talked about this back in my first video, but in case I didn't make it clear, no, I don't think China and Russia don't like gay people is a valid excuse not to have queer characters in these films. If anything, given how popular these movies are in countries where discussions of queer identities is forbidden, I'd say it's all the more reason to include them. But lo and behold, we live in a post-Black Panther and Captain Marvel's massive box office numbers world. And next year we're finally getting our first openly gay superhero in the Eternals. We don't have a confirmation of which character is gonna be yet, but we do know Valkyrie will be openly bisexual in Thor: Love and Thunder. So Marvel is gifting us with not one, but two queer superheroes soon. How generous of them. TV-wise, DC is king, with the Arrowverse giving us a bi White Canary, a bi Constantine, a bi Captain Cold, and our first live-action transgender superhero, Dreamer, as well as a solo Batwoman series fresh out of the oven. Plus, outside of that continuity, we also have Negative Man on Doom Patrol, and of course, Lucifer.
What? It's called a devil's threesome for a reason.
Marvel, meanwhile, has had two minor recurring gay characters in Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., Carolina and Nico in Runaways, good, and Jerry Hogarth in Jessica Jones. She cheated on her wife and was ultimately responsible for her murder. Jerry's an interesting character, but yeah. Have a glad award, Marvel. But who knows, now that the X-Men will be retooled for the MCU, perhaps Iceman will be openly gay this time around. And there's a Loki series being made for Disney+. Maybe they'll touch on his bisexuality there. Or maybe not. Look, given how long a self-congratulatory jerk-off session the Russo brothers and Marvel had for that bullshit first openly gay Marvel character in Endgame, I am extremely cautious about how all this is gonna go down. Even Valkyrie. In Taika we trust, but as we've seen in Ragnarok, he does not have the final say in these films. We'll see. But here's the naked truth. The world has changed since Superman first put on his red cape. We still tend to think of the mainstream as meaning cis heterosexual men, and I'm totally guilty of that too. But while this group very much detains most of the power in the world, and are largely responsible for deciding what stories are told in the media we consume, real life is a lot richer than one single type of narrative. Just look around. Superheroes are, and have always been, queer. They're a source of inspiration for any marginalized individual who's constantly put down by the world. A reminder that we can always rise up, and that there's more to us than what we're told we are. So, frankly, it was ludicrous how long it took for queer superheroes to appear in comics, and downright pathetic how we're only now getting them in the movies. But alas, the road to include minorities in stuff being made by the mainstream is always long and arduous, because it is not in the interest of big companies to challenge the status quo. Hell, I doubt Disney would have even strayed from the white dude saves the day formula had they not been called out on it, and had they not successfully established the MCU as the most popular and lucrative form of entertainment today. And even then, they might not have done it if DC hadn't upped the stakes by announcing diversity straight from the get-go, and had Wonder Woman prove it to be not only doable, but extremely lucrative. Yeah, it would be nice to believe Marvel's Phase 4 is set to be so diverse because Disney had a come-to-Jesus moment and are doing this out of the kindness of their heart, but they're not. They're doing this because it's been financially successful to them before, and because they know they have to keep up with the times, and change things up if they don't want to lose their biggest cash cow to audience fatigue. I'm reminded of what writer Gail Simone once said regarding diversity in the superhero comics industry. Almost all the tentpoles we built our industry upon were created over a half-century ago, at a time where the characters were almost without exception white, cisgendered, straight, on and on. It's fine, it's great that people love those characters, but if we only build around them, then we look like an episode of the Andy Griffith Show for all eternity. You can't argue with that. All we can do is keep fighting for diversity and make sure the soulless corporations responsible for the media we consume get our message and put in the work so they don't screw it up.
We'll be watching.